ecology is a study of interactions. Interactions between organisms and other organisms. Those organisms can be the same species. Those organisms can be different species. And interactions between organisms and the environment, either on a small scale when we think about things like a tree, or on a larger scale, things like patterns of precipitation. But the study of ecology at its core is the study of how organisms interact with other organisms as well as its environment. This is a harlequin toad, lives in Costa Rica and Panama, and it is currently being influenced by its environment because a fungal infection is spreading, and that fungal infection gets into his moist, thin skin, and literally he dies of mold. Okay, it's kind of a brutal way to go. And so the fungus is itself its own organism, but that interaction is an ecological interaction. But the fact that the fungus grows so readily there is because of the very warm, moist environment that is very easy for fungi to grow in. And so there's also interactions based on those features in the environment as well. What makes these organisms at risk for extinction? It's going to come back to genetic diversity. Remember when we talked about evolution, that those populations that were most easily ready to adapt and respond to their environments were the ones that had a lot of genetic variation. Because then the environment selects for those that are suited to their environment and selects against those who are not suited to their environment. So populations that have a lot of genetic diversity are populations that are most likely to be able to withstand issues such as this one. The more genetic diversity, the more likely that that organism can survive. The less genetic diversity, the less likely that species is going to be able to withstand these sorts of threats. There are several different levels of study when it comes to ecology, from the global level all the way down to looking at the organismal level. But no matter what level you're looking at, what you're investigating is how these organisms interact with other organisms or the environment. So how does ocean circulation that happens on a global level affect the distribution of crustaceans? Crustaceans are things with an exoskeleton like crabs and lobsters and stuff like that. Okay? So we're looking at interactions on a global level. Landscape ecology. To what extent do the trees lining a river serve as corridors of dispersal for animals? So here's our river, and you can see the trees lining that river. Who lives in those trees, and are they going to stay within the trees, or can they wander out? Ecosystem ecology. What factors control photosynthetic productivity in a grassland ecosystem? Well, if we're looking at the rate of photosynthesis, are we looking at sunlight, temperature, nutrient availability, right? Interactions between that ecosystem and the abiotic factors. Community ecology, what factors influence the diversity of species that make up a forest. Population ecology, what environmental factors affect the reproductive rate of flamingos. Again, interactions. We're looking at how organisms interact. Organismal biology, we start looking at one particular organism. How do baby peanut turtles overwinter in sub-freezing temperatures without freezing themselves? The interaction between that one individual and its environment. That's the topic I wrote my master's thesis on. You Google my maiden name, it'll pop right up. So, first, we're going to talk a little bit about climate. If you took CP Physical Science, you learned about weather. For those of you who took honors chemistry, we pretend like you already know. So we're going to take 5 slides here and just tell you what we teach in CP Level 9th grade class. So the difference between climate and weather. Climate is the long-term prevailing weather conditions. Weather is the day-to-day changes. Day before yesterday it was snowy. Today it is sunny. That's weather. Okay. There are 4 components of climate. Climate itself is abiotic. It's a non-living feature of our planet. There's 4 components that influence climate. Temperature, that would make sense to us, right? Because we can think that, climate in Colorado is quite different than the climate in, I don't know, Canada, and temperature is a big part of that. But also precipitation. Okay? Our temperature could be the same as, I don't know, Central California, but the amount of precipitation we get is dramatically different. How much sunlight, comparing maybe Seattle, which has a lot of clouds, to Denver. And how much wind. We don't often think of wind as a feature, but wind can really, really change climate and the organisms that live there. In very windy areas, we don't have many, many tall trees. We tend to have shorter trees because the wind makes it very difficult for those species to exist. But biotic factors are also going to influence distribution and abundance of living things also. Other organisms that are part of an individual environment. We call that macroclimate. Macroclimate is climate that is on a global, regional, or a landscape level. And this itself is influenced by geography, the tilt of our axis, the planet's axis. Bodies of water, because remember the property of water is that water is a temperature buffer. Mountains, we live in a rain shadow, right? That's why it's so dry here. These geographic features hugely impact the climate around them. So let's start by talking about variation in sunlight. It's caused by Earth's curved shape. So we can all probably agree that our planet is traditionally the warmest at the equator. But the sun actually strikes north of the equator quite a lot and south of the equator quite a lot. So why is it in the summer in Alaska, the tilt of the planet is actually tilted toward the sun, northern hemisphere tilted toward the sun, a lot of sunlight in Alaska in the summer, 18, 19, 20 hours a day, right? But yet it's still colder there than at the equator. Oftentimes students will think, well, it's just closer. Well, no, it's not. It has nothing to do with closeness. It has to do with the intensity of the sun's rays. So the sun, imagine the sun is over here. It's really like, way over there someplace. But imagine it's here, and the sun is shooting its rays right here. Here, those rays hit very directly the planet, whereas here they hit at an angle. Here they hit at an angle. So the rays are literally spread out. So the density of these rays coming in is not as high as here. And because these rays hit directly, and these are more diffuse, the number of hours of sunlight is almost immaterial. It really more comes down to how directly those rays of sun are hitting the planet. So, the more direct rays hit here at the equator, that heats up the equator more, and it heats up the air at the equator more. Well, warm air holds more water than cold air. So then what ends up happening is the planet is bombarded at the middle of the planet, at the equator, with light and heat, heats up the middle, causes a whole lot of water to evaporate, goes into the warmer air, and it stays there because warm air holds more water vapor. Well, meanwhile, the planet is spinning. It does that without stopping. And as it spins, it has to spin faster here than here. Why? Because the distance around the middle is larger than the distance at the pole. So because it's spinning as a unit, the fastest movement is here, and the slowest movement is here and here. So what does that mean? That means that we end up with these massive winds, okay? Because the planet is spinning, the air is heating, the water is evaporating, all of this is happening at the same time. This is earth science, right? Can't separate out your different spheres. We end up with these trade winds. Do you ever notice that our weather here in Colorado always comes from California, Washington, and Oregon? It always moves from the west to the east. And then after it leaves us, it goes to Chicago, and after it leaves Chicago, it goes to the East Coast, right? Sometimes the East Coast gets some stuff that moves down from Canada also, but the weather always moves from west to east. It's because It doesn't ever go backwards. Right? Where does the sun rise? In the east. And where does it set? In the west. Always? Yes. For the same reason. Because we're spinning in that direction. Okay? So, while all this is happening, here's your equator. The moist air that was heated here collected all of that water vapor. As it rises, it gets cooler. Well, as the air gets cooler, it can't hold on to as much water, and so it all falls as precipitation. That's why we end up with rainforests that are near the equator, because those rainforests exist in the bands where all this water falls. Okay? Earth science. Let's talk about the tilt of our axis. Why do we have seasons? We have seasons because our planet is tilted at 23.5 degrees relative, it should say, to its plane, relative to its plane of orbit around the sun. So the intensity of solar radiation is going to vary seasonally. So in the northern hemisphere, here we are tilted, we're always spinning on our axis, but note the tilt is the same always. The tilt doesn't change. So what that means is that in the summer, for us, the northern hemisphere is tilted toward the sun. And in the winter, the northern hemisphere is tilted away from the sun. Our spring and summer equinox is equal day and night. Okay? We're not tilted toward or away during those times. Very similar weather in those two seasons. Only one of them is the warming trend here, and one of them is the cooling trend here. Okay? So, currents are influencing climate along the coast of continents by heating or cooling the air masses that pass across the land. So in the northern hemisphere, all of our air currents and all of our water are twisting clockwise. In the southern hemisphere, which is not pictured here, they're circulating counterclockwise. This is called the Coriolis effect. It is again the result of the equator having to move faster than everything else. But I want you to notice the implications for our organisms. Here, as we move clockwise, the water that's coming down the coast of California is coming from the Arctic. This water is very cold. And that's why if you go to a beach right around here, you need a wetsuit, because you're not going in there without it. It's freezing. All those seals have blubber, right? They're good to go. But if we scooch on over to the Carolinas, not so bad, right? Again, we're still looking at the clockwise flow, but here we're pulling water up from the equator. This is warmer water that's coming up. You see what I mean? So, even though we're at the same latitude, this will be colder water to this warmer water. This is also why we experience an awful lot more hurricanes here. Hurricanes need warm water and a lot of energy. Well, that's coming from our equator. That's where that heat is. So, hurricanes form and they spin right on in following that clockwise trail. All of these things come together in order to create climate and environment. And we just pretend like you know this and you skip. Mountains is another big one. Mountains can influence how air flows over land, creating a rain shadow. Why does this happen? Well, a warm air mass over an ocean picks up a lot of moisture out of that ocean, comes onto land. This happens in Seattle. Rain, 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 rain. But once we get to the mountains, that air mass has to go up to get over the mountains. Every 1,000 meters in elevation gain will drop 6 degrees Celsius. But as that air cools, it's capable of holding less water. So the air cools and cools and cools. It can't hold all that water as gas. So what does it do? Condenses and falls as rain. That air mass comes on over the continental divide, and how much water is left in it? Very little. So where do we get our big snow-making storms? The big snow-making storms we get either have enough water in them to still have some left after they've crossed the top, or or they actually go further south, right? And they end up hanging out over that southeastern corner of Colorado, and that's where we're actually, again with that flow of water, we end up with the upslope flow dumping the water on us here in the Front Range. Very rarely do we actually have a moist air mass make it over the top of Colorado and still, or over the top of the Rocky Mountains, and still have enough moisture in it to give us precipitation here in Colorado. So biomes. A biome is a major life zone characterized by a particular type of vegetation or by the physical environment. So vegetation in terrestrial biomes is what dictates what kind of biome it is. And the physical environment is what dictates the type of biome in an aquatic situation. So since climate shows such strong latitudinal patterns, left to right patterns, so too do biomes. Two abiotic factors are most important in determining the distribution of a biome are annual mean temperature and annual mean precipitation. So, if you look closely, these are your maps of biomes. Here are your different biomes. On the whole, the biomes go left to right. The exceptions are your mountain ranges. Mountain range here, mountain range here, mountain range here, mountains here, and here. So the mountain range altitude overpowers the other features. But if you ignore that, we have a lot of the left and the right. And why is that? Because of how the sun is hitting the planet is something that is latitudinally impacted. This thing is called a climograph. On the x-axis is precipitation. On the y-axis is temperature. You could memorize where all of these different biomes fit on your climograph, or you could be smart and figure it out. So, I'm going to give you 1 minute, not 2, because we're running short on time, to see if you could figure out where these 6 biomes fit on your climograph. So remember, this is precipitation. And this is temperature. Okay, so who's got the least water and the highest temperature? Deserts. Okay, who's got a ton of water and high temperature? Tropical rainforest. All right, so we started with our easy ones, right? So lower temperature and lower rain. Arctic tundra. Okay, so now we are down to our forests. Well, we have 2 forests and a grassland. Do grasses or trees require more water? Trees. So if we're looking at less water here, what's this one?
The grassland.
The grassland. Yeah. Okay, so then we have 2 kinds of trees. We have broadleaf trees and coniferous trees. Which one? Yeah, we're like, I don't know the difference. Yes, you do. Which one has cones?
Coniferous.
Oh, yeah, see? Coniferous trees make cones. All right, do we find pine trees in cold areas or hot areas?
Cold, so it's the bottom.
Oh, okay. So this is going to be a broadleaf forest. This is going to be a coniferous forest. Do you see how we're able to be smart and not have to memorize things? That's easier. That's easier. I'm less stressed with it. Okay. So that thing called a climograph, what it doesn't take into account is the pattern of variation. So, for example, look at this overlap, specifically right here. There are 3 different biomes that exist with that amount of precipitation and that temperature. Could be a grassland, could be a coniferous forest, could be a broadleaf forest. Well, how do we tell them apart? What causes that? Well, what causes that is something that this graph doesn't take into account. And that is the pattern of precipitation. So let's say, I'm just making this number up, that amount of precipitation, right here, let's say that's 12 inches per year. Well, in this area, maybe all 12 of those inches come in the same day. Maybe in this area, those 12 inches come spread out over one season. And maybe in this area, those 12 inches are spread out equally throughout the year. The pattern of precipitation is hugely influential to the organisms that can live there, but that information is not included in this kind of a graph, and that's why we see overlap in some of these different biomes. We also have something called an ecotone. We don't have a crisp, clean edge to a desert and into a grassland, and a crisp grassland edge that goes into a forest. It's more gradual than that, and that's what we call an ecotone. Here's what I need from you. I am not going to march through the 8 biomes, okay? Mostly because you don't need to know all 8. You need to pick one biome in your textbook, and you need to know it well. These are the 3 pages in your textbook dedicated to terrestrial biomes. Please do me a favor. Pick a biome that Colorado is in. There's no sense in you trying to memorize a whole bunch of information. Pick one that's easy for you. Okay? Pick the mountain one. Okay? Pick the grassland one. Pick one that's easy for you. Okay? We're going to talk very briefly about aquatic biomes, mostly so that you know the difference between some of the terms. Aquatic biomes show way less variation than terrestrial biomes. We have freshwater and marine, which has to do with whether there's salt in the water or not. Freshwater biomes tend to be linked to soils and biotic components of the terrestrial biome. Okay? But there's also this impact of pattern and speed of water movement. A pond is a different biome than a stream, which is a different biome than a river, okay, based on how quickly the water is moving. The oceans, of course, make up the largest marine biome, 75% of the Earth's surface. Oceans are hugely important to us. They give us rainfall, they impact global climate, wind patterns, marine algae give us oxygen, take up carbon dioxide. Of course, we eat a lot of things that come out of the ocean. Just briefly, the vocabulary words associated with this. If you've ever walked from the shore into the lake, where you are wading, that is the littoral zone. Where you are swimming, that is the limnetic zone. Okay. The scary zone. Sure. Where going deep, where light can penetrate, we call it the photic zone. That makes sense because photons, right, light. So where light can penetrate is the photic zone. Where light cannot penetrate is called the aphotic zone. Okay. So we have like opposites. You see we have the 2 opposites there and there. And then our last set of opposites is benthic and pelagic. Benthic zone, the benthos live. That's like the dirt and the creatures that live in the dirt. It's like crabs, mussels, stuff that lives in the dirt. Anything that swims above the dirt lives in the pelagic zone, also the scary zone. If you've ever been wandering in the beach, no matter how warm it is, if you've ever come to like a pocket of cold water, you're like, what is that? That's the thermocline. Now it has a name. The thermocline separates. There's a uniformly warm upper layer and a uniformly cold deeper layer. And when you find it, that is a surprise. Pull your feet up. Ah! Okay. We're going to start 40.3, where we're going to talk a little bit about species distributions. Species distributions, where organisms live, are a consequence of both ecological and evolutionary interactions through time. This differential ability of organisms to survive and reproduce leads to evolutionary change in ecological time. So minute to minute, things that are happening to organisms. Can I find food? Can I escape this predator? Can I photosynthesize? Okay. Is there a fungus here to help me get nutrients out of the dirt? Those sorts of interactions between the organisms and the environment are what cause differential survival and reproduction that we talked about in Unit 6. So the very simple question without a simple answer is this one. Why don't all organisms on the planet live everywhere? Well, why don't we have kangaroos in Wyoming? There's an ocean between Australia and here. Seems like a reasonable answer. Okay, so let's suggest we brought them and released them in Wyoming. Could they live there? I don't know. Maybe.
Different levels of like.
I say kangaroos in Wyoming because that was on Facebook yesterday as somebody's Facebook or April Fool's joke.
They had a kangaroo farm.
Yeah, well, that they were releasing them into Wyoming because they were endangered in Australia, none of which is true. All right, so we call this dispersal. there's two different factors that influence the distribution of species. And one of them is dispersal. Can the organisms get there in the first place? In kangaroos in Wyoming, the answer is no. They can't get there, okay? They can't get from their area of origin, so where the speciation event actually occurred, into another area. That could be due to geographic isolation, as we're dealing with here. Okay. But it could also have to do with biotic factors. If the dispersal isn't the issue, what is limiting distribution? So polar bears live in Canada and Alaska. They could walk here. There is no ocean, and yet they have not. So why don't we have polar bears in Wyoming? Well, that's where we get into these other reasons why organisms may not be in this area. So as ecologists study factors limiting a species distribution, they consider a bunch of questions. Is the issue dispersal? Well, for the kangaroo issue, yeah. For the polar bear, why don't we have them in Wyoming? No. There are other factors that are limiting distribution. Is it predation? Well, probably not for a polar bear. He can eat anybody he wants. But maybe it's an abiotic factor, like the temperature's not right. Ah, that's probably the issue for a polar bear. He'd cook in his own blubber. Okay. Biotic factors are those that involve other species. Predation and herbivory can really restrict the ability of organisms to survive and reproduce, as can the presence or absence of other species that can be important pollinators, food sources, maybe parasites or pathogens that would disproportionately feed on or affect these organisms. So here's just a quick data set to show that not all organisms have the same impact on their environment. This is a tide pool ecosystem. Sea urchins and limpets are both herbivores in tide pools. Both of them are naturally found. And so this scientist was trying to investigate the different roles that urchins and limpets have on how much seaweed covers a particular area. Well, no great surprise, if you take out all the herbivores, what happens to the amount of seaweed? It goes through the roof. And if you have both urchins and limpets present, that's our red line, we have very little seaweed because they're eating everything. Interestingly enough, if you remove only the limpets, these guys, these are like snails but with a pointy shell. Okay. If they remove only the limpets, the urchins take over. But if they remove the urchins, the limpets don't. So what this is simply showing you is that not all herbivores have the same amount of impact on an environment. You have to look at each species individually to understand how it's causing changes in the ecosystem. But we can also have abiotic factors that can influence distribution. If the physical conditions at a site do not allow a species to survive and reproduce, the species simply cannot be found there. Temperature. We talked about temperature's role in changing enzyme structure. That's a huge one. Organisms function best within a particular range of environmental temperature. But availability of water and oxygen are also biggies. On land, it's the availability of water. You must be able to obtain enough water to survive, and different organisms have different adaptations in order to make that hold true. In aquatic environments, oxygen is essentially the same thing. It's the limiting factor. You have to be able to get enough oxygen in order to survive. But then we also have an issue with salinity. If the salt concentration of water in the environment greatly affects the water balance because of osmosis, you have to have the proper adaptations to survive in a freshwater environment or any degree of saltiness. The amount of sunlight absorbed by photosynthetic organisms can also provide energy that drives ecosystems. Too little or too much can impact distribution of plants. And then rocks and soil. This is another big one for plants. The pH of the dirt, the mineral composition, the structure of rocks, the soil, all of those things can limit the distribution of plants. And if we limit the distribution of plants, we limit the distribution of herbivores. And if we limit the distribution of herbivores, we limit the distribution of carnivores. So all of these are abiotic or non-living factors that can influence the ecosystem that can exist, that is essentially the result of dispersion and availability. Next class we'll pick up with this.